Welcome to our deep dive into grief. You've given me some fascinating research on this, spanning psychology, neuroscience, and even immunology. Wow. We're going to explore how grief affects you, not just emotionally, but like physically, and even at the level of your brain.
Yeah, it's really amazing how much we've learned about grief, especially when you consider that the first systematic study didn't even happen until like the mid 20th century.
Oh, that's right. It was actually a psychiatrist, Eric Lindeben, who really put grief research on the map.
Yeah, after the Coconut Grove fire in 1944, Lindemann studied the survivors, and he identified these common patterns in their reactions, both physical and emotional. And that laid the groundwork for decades of research.
That's a really powerful example of how sometimes, even in the face of tragedy, we find breakthroughs in understanding ourselves. So from that point, like, where did grief research go? One thing that really struck me in the research that you gave me was the idea that maybe grief isn't always this debilitating long-term experience like we often see in
You're
movies.
talking about George Bonanno's work.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, he's really challenged the assumption that intense grief is inevitable.
Yeah, his research found that about 60% of people show resilience after a loss, meaning they don't experience long-term depression or problems in their daily lives. That's a lot higher than I would have expected.
It really highlights the adaptability of the human spirit. Now, this isn't to say that grief isn't real or painful for these individuals. They experience sadness and loss, but it doesn't completely derail their lives.
That's actually really reassuring to hear. But what about the other side of the coin? You also sent me some research on what's called complicated grief disorder.
Yeah, this affects about 10% of bereaved individuals. These are the folks who might experience grief so intensely that it impacts their ability to, function in their daily lives, sometimes for years. And this kind of grief can manifest in some surprising ways, even physically.
Okay, now you've got me intrigued. Tell me more about this physical impact.
Well, there's this phenomenon called the widowhood effect. It refers to the statistically significant increase in mortality rates, particularly within the first 6 months after a spouse dies.
So you're saying that grief can literally affect your lifespan. I mean, what's the science behind that?
Well, researchers believe that the immense stress of losing a loved one can trigger a cascade of physiological changes in the body. For example, studies have shown that bereaved individuals have a 22% higher risk of death compared to married counterparts.
22%? That's a huge difference. What are some of the specific ways that this stress manifests in the body? Does it lead to certain illnesses?
It's not just one thing. We see a higher risk of cardiovascular events like heart attacks and strokes, and even increased risk of developing cancer, diabetes, and infections. It seems grief weakens the body's defenses.
Wow, it sounds like grief really does a number on your system. Do researchers know exactly what's happening at a physiological level to cause these effects?
They're finding clues by looking at biomarkers, which are like biological indicators of what's going on inside the body.
Okay, like what kinds of biomarkers?
Well, for example, your body releases a hormone called cortisol when you're stressed, right? And during grief, cortisol levels can spike. And over time, this can actually weaken your immune system, making you more susceptible to getting sick.
So it's not just that you're feeling bad emotionally, but your body is physically reacting to the grief in a way that makes you more vulnerable.
Exactly, and it gets even more interesting. Research suggests that your genes can actually influence how intensely your body reacts to grief.
Wait, so our genes can dictate how we experience grief. How does that work?
Well, certain genes regulate inflammation in the body, and some people have variations in these genes that make them more prone to inflammation, which could explain why their physical health might be more affected by loss.
That's fascinating. It seems like grief is this incredibly complex interplay of our emotions, our physical bodies, and even our DNA.
Absolutely. And while the body is reacting in these measurable ways, there's a whole other dimension of grief happening in the mind. How we process the loss, the thoughts we have, and the coping strategies we use all play a crucial role in how we adapt.
Okay, so let's shift gears and talk about that mental and emotional side of things. What are some of the key factors that influence how intensely someone grieves?
Well, think about it. Everyone grieves differently, right? Some people might find themselves constantly thinking about the loss, replaying memories and what ifs, while others might try to avoid thinking about it altogether.
Right. Those are two very different approaches, but it sounds like you're describing two key mental processes that the research mentions: rumination and avoidance.
Exactly. Rumination is like getting stuck in a loop of negative thoughts and feelings related to the loss. It can trap you in a cycle of pain and make it harder to move forward.
And avoidance is, well, just as it sounds, trying to push away the painful thoughts and emotions associated with grief.
Yes, but here's the thing. Both rumination and avoidance, while understandable, can actually hinder the grieving process in the long run.
So even though it feels natural to either dwell on the loss or try to avoid it completely, neither extreme is particularly helpful.
Exactly. Finding a balance is key, which is something we can delve into further.
Okay, this is all starting to paint a really interesting picture of how intricate grief is. We've talked about the body's reaction and the mind's adaptation, but there's another piece to this puzzle, right?
You're right. We can't forget about the brain, the control center of it all. Neuroscience is starting to uncover fascinating insights into how the brain processes grief, and turns out it's not as straightforward as we might think. Welcome back to our deep dive on grief. We left off talking about how neuroscience is shedding light on the brain's role in all of this. One of the papers you gave me even mentions that grief can trigger activity in the brain's reward centers. That seems counterintuitive.
It is surprising, isn't it? So even though grief is like a painful experience, the brain might be interpreting that longing, that deep connection, in a way that overlaps with feelings of love.
That's one way to think about it. It highlights the complexity of these emotions and how intertwined they can be.
It really makes you think about the nature of love and loss and how deeply those experiences are wired into our brains. But going back to those two coping mechanisms we discussed, rumination and avoidance, if those can be detrimental, what are some healthier ways to manage the mental and emotional turmoil of grief?
Well, it's important to remember that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to grieving. What works for one person might not work for another, but there are evidence-based strategies that can help.
Okay, so no magic bullet, but some tools for the toolbox. Can you give me some specific examples?
Absolutely. Given the impact grief has on the body, prioritizing physical health is crucial. This means focusing on the basics, getting enough sleep, eating nutritious foods, and engaging in moderate exercise.
I can see how those things would be beneficial, but honestly, they also sound incredibly hard to do when you're grieving.
You're absolutely right. Grief can disrupt sleep patterns, zap your appetite, and make even the thought of exercise feel overwhelming. But even small steps can make a difference.
So maybe instead of aiming for like a full workout, just a short walk outside.
Yeah,
Or focusing on eating one balanced meal a day.
exactly. It's about listening to your body and doing what you can, recognizing that some days will be harder than others. And it's not just about the physical. Taking care of your mental and emotional well-being is just as important.
So what can we do to support ourselves on that front?
Well, understanding those processes we discussed earlier, rumination and avoidance can be helpful. If you find yourself constantly dwelling on negative thoughts or, feeling overwhelmed by sadness, it might be helpful to explore mindfulness techniques.
So learning to observe those thoughts and feelings without judgment rather than getting swept away by them.
Yes. Mindfulness can help you create some distance from those intense emotions and develop a sense of acceptance. Another approach is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT.
What's the thinking behind that approach?
CBT focuses on identifying and challenging unhelpful thought patterns that contribute to distress. It can provide practical tools for managing negative thoughts and developing more balanced perspectives.
So it's about reframing those, what ifs and catastrophic thinking patterns that can take hold during grief.
Exactly. And remember, avoidance can be sneaky. It might disguise itself as staying constantly busy or numbing yourself with distractions. Creating space to process your emotions, even if it's uncomfortable, is crucial.
So allowing yourself to feel the sadness and the loss instead of trying to push it away.
Yes, but also creating opportunities for joy and connection. Spending time with loved ones, engaging in activities that bring you meaning, even simple acts of self-care can help nurture your emotional well-being.
It sounds like finding that balance between acknowledging the pain of grief and also finding moments of joy is key. Are there situations where seeking professional help might be a good idea?
Absolutely. If you're struggling to cope, if your grief feels all-consuming, or if you're experiencing symptoms of complicated grief, reaching out to a therapist or grief counselor can be incredibly beneficial.
That makes sense. Sometimes we need extra support to navigate these complex emotions, but what about the social aspect of grief? Where does that fit into all of this?
Humans are social creatures, and this is never more apparent than during times of loss. Your support network, family, friends, support groups can provide a lifeline during this difficult time.
So it's not just about taking care of yourself, it's about letting others help you.
Exactly. Talking about your loved one, sharing memories, and allowing others to support you can be incredibly healing.
But what if you don't have a strong support network, or you feel like you're burdening others with your grief?
Those are valid concerns. And that's precisely why grief support groups can be so valuable. They offer a safe and understanding space to connect with others who are going through similar experiences.
It's like knowing you're not alone in this journey.
Exactly. And remember, seeking support is a sign of strength, not weakness. It takes courage to acknowledge that you need help.
Earlier, we were talking about the brain and those fascinating neuroimaging studies. How can we apply that knowledge to help ourselves during grief?
Well, we know that the default network, which is involved in self-reflection and memory, is highly active during grief. This suggests that creating opportunities for mindful reflection and memory sharing could be beneficial.
So journaling, looking through photo albums, or reminiscing with loved ones.
Yeah, these activities can help you process your emotions, strengthen your connection to your loved one's memory, and foster a sense of meaning-making.
It's like honoring the past while finding ways to move forward.
And remember the salience network, the one that acts as our brain's alarm system.
Right, the one that alerts us to what's important.
In grief, this network can become hyperactivated, making you more sensitive to triggers and reminders of your loss.
So even small things, like a song or a scent, can unexpectedly bring a wave of grief.
Exactly. That's why it's important to be kind to yourself and practice self-compassion. Recognize that these reactions are a normal part of the grieving process and try to create a supportive environment that minimizes unnecessary triggers.
It sounds like being mindful of your surroundings and giving yourself permission to step away from situations that feel overwhelming is key.
Absolutely. And lastly, let's not forget the executive network, the brain's control center. This network plays a crucial role in regulating emotions and managing stress.
So how do we support our executive network during grief?
Engaging in activities that strengthen cognitive function can be helpful. This could include things like puzzles, brain games, or learning new skills.
So keeping our minds active can actually help us cope with grief more effectively.
It's not about distracting yourself from the grief, but rather about providing your brain with the resources it needs to manage the emotional and cognitive demands of this challenging time.
This is also fascinating. It's like we're starting to understand grief not just as an emotional experience, but as something that affects us on so many levels.
Exactly. And with that understanding, we can start to develop more compassionate and effective ways to support ourselves and others through this universal human experience.
Welcome back to our final segment of this deep dive into grief. You know, in the previous parts, we explored the multifaceted nature of grief, how it affects us physically, emotionally, and even cognitively. And we talked about some strategies for navigating this complex experience.
Yeah, it's been really eye-opening to learn about the science behind grief and to realize just how profound its impact can be on our overall well-being. But before we wrap things up, I'm curious to explore the potential long-term consequences, especially when grief is prolonged or becomes what researchers call complicated grief. Yeah, that's an important aspect to consider. When grief becomes complicated, it can increase the risk of a range of mental and physical health issues.
Okay, let's delve into that a bit. What are some of the specific risks associated with complicated grief?
Well, on the mental health front, complicated grief can increase the likelihood of developing major depressive disorder, anxiety disorders, and even post-traumatic stress disorder. In some cases, it can also contribute to substance abuse problems as individuals try to, numb the pain.
So it's like a ripple effect where grief can trigger a cascade of other mental health challenges.
Exactly. And these conditions can, in turn, exacerbate the grieving process, creating a vicious cycle that can be difficult to break free from.
That makes sense. We've already talked about the widowhood effect, the increased risk of mortality in the early stages of grief. Does that risk persist with complicated grief?
Unfortunately, yes. Studies have shown that individuals with complicated grief have a higher risk of developing chronic health conditions, including cardiovascular disease, autoimmune disorders, and even certain types of cancer.
Wow. That's really concerning. It seems like complicated grief can cast a long shadow over a person's life, affecting their overall well-being for years to come.
Yeah, it really underscores the importance of recognizing the signs of complicated grief and seeking professional support early on.
So what are some red flags that might indicate someone is struggling with complicated grief? What should people be looking out for?
One of the key signs is intense yearning or longing for the deceased that persists for an extended period, often accompanied by difficulty accepting the reality of the loss. There might also be persistent feelings of bitterness or anger related to the death, and a sense of being stuck or unable to move forward with their own life.
So it's not just about feeling sad, it's about those feelings interfering with their ability to function and find meaning in their life without their loved one.
Exactly. If you or someone you know is experiencing these symptoms, it's essential to seek professional help. There are effective therapies, such as complicated grief therapy, that can help individuals process their grief in a healthy way and develop coping strategies.
That's good to know. While we've been focusing on the potential negative consequences of unaddressed grief, is there a flip side to this? Can navigating grief successfully lead to positive changes in a person's life?
That's a great question, and one that often gets overlooked. While grief is undeniably painful, it can also be a catalyst for personal growth and transformation. Many individuals who navigate grief effectively report experiencing a newfound appreciation for life, a deeper understanding of their own resilience, and a stronger sense of connection to others.
It's like the saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Precisely. Grief can shake us to our core, forcing us to reevaluate our priorities, values, and beliefs. This process, while challenging, can lead to profound personal growth and a richer, more meaningful life.
That's a really hopeful message to end on. It reminds us that even in the darkest of times, there's always potential for healing and transformation.
Absolutely. Grief is a journey, and like any journey, it had its ups and downs. But with the right support and self-care, it's possible to emerge from this experience stronger and more connected to ourselves and the world around us.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive. We've explored grief from multiple angles, uncovering a wealth of insights into its impact on the body, the mind, and the brain. As we wrap up, what would you say is the most important takeaway for our listener?
I think the key takeaway is that grief is a normal and natural human response to loss. It's not a sign of weakness, and there's no right or wrong way to grieve. Understanding this and recognizing the potential long-term consequences of complicated grief can empower you to seek support, prioritize your well-being, and ultimately find a path toward healing and growth.
That's a really powerful message. We've covered a lot of ground today, but remember, this is just the beginning of your own personal exploration. As you continue to learn and grow, we encourage you to delve deeper into the resources available and connect with others who have walked this path before you. And remember, even in the face of profound loss, there's always hope for healing and the potential for a brighter future. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into grief.
Until next time.